Well, we made it. We're up to the final video of the summer class. And what we're going to do in this video is just cover a few topics from Chapter 14. Chapter 14 is a chapter that I don't like to cover in its entirety because I don't think a lot of students find it terribly interesting, and also a lot of the topics in it are pretty simple. So we're just going to cover a few of the issues that I think you guys will find most pertinent to your lives and most interesting. So we're going to talk about monetarism, real interest rates, and the velocity of money in this video. And we'll start with number one, monetarism. Monetarism, simply put, is the school of economic thought that focuses on monetary policy as a tool for avoiding swings in the economy. And we may call monetarism one of the three main belief systems in economics. We've got classical economics. Basic belief there is that if the economy is doing really poorly, if it's in a recessionary gap, the government shouldn't do anything about it. There's Keynesian economics, which would suggest if the economy is in a recessionary gap, the government should get involved and do expansionary fiscal policy. And then there's monetarists who focus on the effectiveness of monetary policy. So monetary policy, as you've seen in earlier lectures, is the altering of the money supply to influence inflation and interest rates. Here's the basic belief. So let's suppose the economy is in a recessionary gap. And let's see if you guys can remember this. Let's draw it two different ways here. On the left, we're going to think about it from a classical standpoint. And on the right, we'll show the Keynesian graph. Okay, a little bit of a blast from the past here, seeing these graphs again, because I know it's been a little while. But that's the classical economics graph at short-run equilibrium. And if they're in a recessionary gap, that would suggest that our long-run aggregate supply is here. Thus, the natural real GDP is above the real GDP curve. So that's the classical economic belief system. Here's the Keynesian economic belief system. Aggregate supply curve is flat and then vertical. It shows us the natural real GDP. And our aggregate demand curve must be on that flat portion, which is why the economy is in a recessionary gap. So we've done this with classical and Keynesian economics. We showed why classical economists believe this would fix itself. We showed why Keynes thought the economy should be fixed by government intervention. Monetarists would have more in common with Keynes. They certainly would suggest that there should be some sort of intervention. But the monetarists would suggest monetary intervention. So monetary policy is a better way to handle this if you're a monetary economist. So these monetarists would suggest expansionary monetary policy. Now, what do you think that means? Expansionary monetary policy. How do you expand the economy through monetary means? Well, according to the monetarists, they believe that this can be done by increasing the money supply. And only the Fed has the ability to do this directly, right? Only the Fed has the ability to inject some changes in the money supply that will have these sorts of effects on the economy. So they can do this by any of those four ways we talked about before. Open market purchases, lowering the required reserve rate, dropping the discount rate below the federal funds rate, and targeting a low federal funds rate. All of those measures would work to increase the money supply. And the belief here is that with more money, there's more disposable income, right? More YD, more disposable income. And as a result, the aggregate demand increases because with more disposable income, people spend more money. So aggregate demand shifts right. So it doesn't matter which of these graphs you actually use. This could fix the recessionary gap in either case. So aggregate demand shifts to the right here. That pushes prices higher. It makes sense that prices would be higher, right? Because with more money in the economy, you would expect prices to go up. And then the real GDP will reach the natural. Okay? Now, it's not necessarily the case that monetarists disagreed with the classical economic thought. They didn't necessarily think that the economy wouldn't fix itself, but rather, why wait? If we can fix the economy now, why not fix it quickly? And so we could boost the economy through monetary policy. Keynesian graph similar. Boost aggregate demand through more money. That will push the economy towards their natural real GDP if we go far enough with it. And depending on the shift of the aggregate demand, based on the way I drew it, the CPI would go up as well. So this can accomplish what Keynesian economics would suggest with expansionary fiscal policy. But there's some pretty big benefits. Expansionary fiscal policy causes governmental debt. Expansionary monetary policy, as we showed in the last video, can actually reduce the debt because the Fed takes its profits and gives it to the federal government. Think about the other problems with expansionary fiscal policy. This is things we talked about back in Chapter 11. Crowding out. Crowding out is a potential problem, but it doesn't have to be as intense of a problem. If the Fed, for example, encourages lower federal funds rate, there's not really any crowding out happening. Versus expansionary fiscal policy will always cause some sort of crowding out. Time lags. Expansionary fiscal policy takes a long time because we have to pass laws and wait for the laws to actually go into effect and all of that. Monetary policy, they don't have to wait because they're a private organization. They can do whatever they want. So if they decide they want to increase spending, they don't have to pass a bill. They can just do it. So we don't have to worry about time lags as much. Okay? We talked about, again, time lags, as we just discussed, crowding out, and the debt. These are all problems that are certainly substantial in fiscal policy that are erased by expansionary monetary policy. And that's why a lot of people buy into monetarism. So that's monetarism in a nutshell. Not a whole lot to talk about. We talked a lot about classical and Keynesian economics. Monetarism is relatively simple. And once you understand classical and Keynesian viewpoints, monetarism is you can just use the same graphs and think about it that way. All right, so now let's talk about real interest rates. Real interest rates are inflation-adjusted interest rates, as you might have expected. Okay, so this is pretty easy, not hard at all. Let me give you an example of what this looks like. Suppose that I have a CD, a certificate of deposit, that earns 3.1% interest. Okay? By the way, we call that a nominal interest rate. The interest rate the banks tell you you're going to get on anything you're doing, whether you're borrowing or saving, is a nominal interest rate. It doesn't account for inflation. So let's say I have a CD that earns 3.1% interest, and currently the inflation rate is 1.8%. How much real interest am I receiving then? After considering the effects of inflation, how much real interest am I getting? Most students are able to kind of infer what needs to be done here. If my interest rate is 3.1%, but I'm losing 1.8% to inflation, then it's really like I'm getting a 1.3% real inflation rate. This is an easy concept, I think. The real interest rate is simply the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. So in this example here, if I've got 3.1% nominal interest and 1.8% inflation, then that means I'm getting 1.3% real rate of return, 1.3% real interest rate. So what this basically means is my money is growing at 3.1%. Okay? That's the nominal rate of return. But my value or wealth is growing at 1.3%. Okay? Real interest rates are typically a much better way to think about interest rates because they're more informative. If you have a friend that lives in South Africa and your friend says, hey, I'm getting 12% on my interest rate in my bank, isn't that great? Well, you don't really know if that's great. You need to know what the inflation rate is before you can tell if that's a good deal or not. Okay, if there's 12% in interest rate, but inflation is also 12%, then they're not earning any real money, any real wealth. Let me give you one more example here. Some of you maybe have savings accounts. And maybe you're earning a 0.25% interest in your savings account. Inflation right now, I'm not looking at the figures, but I bet it's around 2%. Depending on when you're watching this, 2% is usually a pretty good guess because we tend to hover around that rate on average. If this is the case, what is your real interest rate? Your real interest rate would be 0.25% minus 2%. So that means your real interest rate is negative 1.75%. What does that mean? Is it possible that this could be negative? Yeah, it is. And what it means is that the value in your account is falling by 1.75% annually. And this is truthfully what's happening. And if you have a checking account, if you're like me, I have a checking account that earns 0 interest. Well, if the inflation rate's 2% and I'm earning 0%, I'm losing 2% of my value over time. So this is part of the reason why having such low interest is problematic. It actually doesn't even outpace the inflation rate. What's the answer? What can you do instead? Well, you can look at things like stocks or bonds or something like that, but those can be riskier. So unfortunately, putting your money in checking and savings accounts is often a very reasonable thing to do, even though it yields a negative real return. So that's real interest rates, a pretty simple idea. The third thing I want to talk about is the velocity of money. The velocity of money. Let's first define this term. The velocity of money, let me give you 2 definitions here. The generic definition of velocity of money is to consider how fast is money being spent. All right, so that's a very general way to think about the velocity of money. If money is spending very quickly, then the velocity is really high. If money takes a long time to be spent, then velocity is very low. If you think about it, if you tracked money through time, money could be spent 1 time per year, half a time per year, or 20 times per year. That's what velocity of money is getting at. So that's one way to define it. A more concise or more direct definition is to answer the question, how often does the average dollar of M1, for example, gets spent in a year. And this is an important factor, the velocity of money, for one simple reason. If the velocity goes up, inflation goes up. Okay? If money becomes spent more often, then inflation will actually increase. And conversely, if the velocity goes down, the inflation will go down. Okay? Now, why is this relevant? Why is this worth talking about? Well, let me give you a quick example, and I guess this will be the last example in this class. Let's say the Fed engages in open market purchases. Now, what is that going to do? Okay? Think about what that's going to do. Surprisingly, inflation rates drop. So what do you think's happening here? Open market purchases certainly should increase the money supply. And they will. Open market purchases will increase the money supply. But what if the same time that the money supply is being created, or the same time the money supply is being built up, okay? At the same time of that occurring, what happens if the velocity of money goes down? Well, then in this case, you have two factors that are working opposingly. This increases the money supply, but this would decrease the money supply. And so the only reason I want to bring this up is just to point out that the Fed can't control the money supply alone, the Fed can't determine inflation rates completely by themselves easily. The velocity of money is also important, okay? The bottom line is, if velocity falls 10%, let's say a dollar was being spent 10 times a year and now it's only being spent 9 times a year. If that happens, then inflation also falls 10%. Ceteris paribus. So this velocity of money is a very important factor in determining what's going on in the monetary economy. As somebody who just took this class, I just wanted to mention this because I hear people sometimes talking about things like, oh, well, when the government or when the Fed increases the money supply, we're definitely going to have inflation. A lot of times I hear people talk about hyperinflation. They look at the Fed and they say, wow, the Fed has created a lot of money in recent years. We're definitely going to have hyperinflation. But the issue is, velocity also matters. So while the Fed has been increasing the money supply in recent years, the velocity of money had been declining. They'd virtually been washing each other out. So the Fed has a very difficult challenge. They have to try to predict what's going to happen to the velocity of money. Okay? Again, I point this out just so you realize money supply alone does not determine inflation. The velocity of money, or how often people spend money, is equally important. I guess that's it for this class. I've enjoyed teaching it. I hope you learned something from it, and good luck on the last exam.